On February 21st and 22nd, 2025, the Pacific's balance was shaken. A Chinese naval task force held live fire exercises in the Tasmanian Sea, just 300 nautical miles from Australia. This wasn't just a drill, it was a deliberate show of force, a global warning. China's three-ship task force nearly matches the entire naval firepower of Australia and New Zealand. The Type 055 destroyer Zunyi alone carries 112 VLS cells, almost as many as Australia's three Hobart-class destroyers combined. Supported by a frigate and a replenishment ship, this small fleet outguns and outranges every Australian and New Zealand vessel. Chinese YJ-18 and YJ-21 missiles render Australia's Harpoons obsolete, with the YJ-21 reaching 1,500 kilometers at Mach 10. Australia and New Zealand lack defenses against hypersonic threats. Worse, China has dozens more Type 055 destroyers, and even more advanced Type 076 and 003 carriers not yet deployed here. The entire Australia and New Zealand were suddenly within striking distance. One report estimated it would take just 7.5 minutes for a YJ-21 to reach Sydney. This display of force revealed major defense blind spots. The Australian government reportedly learned about the exercise only after it began, via a commercial airline pilot, not military surveillance or their Five Eyes intelligence allies. The Chinese fleet operated undetected, exposing serious gaps in maritime security. While Australia lodged a diplomatic protest, it acknowledged China's right to operate in international waters. New Zealand echoed this stance. However, public reaction was far less restrained. News outlets highlighted Australia's vulnerability, and social media erupted with shock and outrage. The idea that a foreign power could project such force so close to home with almost no warning sent a chill through both nations. The location, near the Coral Sea, held historical weight. It was here, in World War II, that the US and Australia halted Japan's Pacific advance. The parallel was clear. China is now asserting power where the Japanese Empire once failed. The United States, focused on conflicts elsewhere, responded with muted concern. Some analysts saw this as a deliberate choice, reflecting limited options and strategic priorities. China, on the other hand, defended its actions as lawful and framed them as a reaction to Australian military activity in the South China Sea. This was the first time China had conducted live-fire military exercises in the Tasmanian Sea, so close to major population centers of a Western country. It was a clear signal of China's growing naval power, its willingness to project that power, and the potential vulnerabilities of its neighbors. The question now became, why Australia? And what message was Beijing really sending? Beijing claimed the exercises were retaliation for Australian actions in the South China Sea, but their retaliation explanation rings hollow. Australia's military presence near China is nothing new. Australian aircraft frequently operate in the region, often alongside the US. Yet, China had never responded with this level of force. This wasn't routine posturing. It was an unprecedented show of naval might. The South China Sea incident was merely a pretext, a convenient cover story. The real target of the Tasmanian Sea exercise was the United States. The art of war taught, attack that which they must rescue. In the Pacific, that place is Australia. To challenge American dominance, China needed to test American resolve, its political will, not just its military might. Would the U.S., distracted by conflicts elsewhere, and with a potentially inward-looking administration, risk confrontation with a rising China to defend a distant ally? The muted response from Washington likely emboldened Beijing's strategists. So, why Australia? Several key factors made it the perfect proving ground for this strategic challenge. First, Australia is far more than just a U.S. ally. It is a fundamental pillar of Western power and influence in the Indo-Pacific. A predominantly Anglo-Saxon nation, deeply embedded in the Five Eyes intelligence network, the Quad Security Dialogue, and the AUKUS Pact, Australia represents a crucial extension of American strategic reach. It's a wealthy, resource-rich nation, ideally positioned to dominate the Southern Pacific and act as a bulwark against Chinese expansion. The recent $300 billion commitment to nuclear-powered submarines, weapons designed for offensive power projection, not coastal defense, underscores Australia's role as a forward operating base for Western interests, a proxy willing to do America's bidding in a region far from U.S. shores. This intensified Australia's strategic value, making it a prize Washington could ill afford to lose, and a target Beijing could not ignore. Yet, Australia's own defenses are surprisingly weak. A vast coastline, a relatively small navy, and, as mentioned previously, No defense against hypersonic missiles. The U.S. maintains only a limited presence in the southern Pacific, making a rapid response difficult. Australia also sits squarely on the third island chain, a critical line of defense for the U.S. to contain China. The U.S. fought hard against the Japanese here during World War II in the famous Battle of the Coral Sea. Now, China, by sailing a task force 10,000 kilometers without resupply, directly to the region, signaled its ability to threaten not only Australia, but other key U.S. bases along that chain, including Hawaii and the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. Targeting Australia offered China multiple strategic advantages. It stretched U.S. resources thin, forcing Washington to react far from other potential flashpoints like Taiwan and the Philippines. It provided a veneer of legitimacy, a supposed response to Australia's actions in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. And, critically, the Australian and New Zealand governments' responses were surprisingly weak, especially when compared to the more assertive, even provocative stances of nations like Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. While acknowledging the legality of the exercises and emphasizing freedom of navigation, essentially conceding China's right to operate there, both governments downplayed any threat, stressing that China had complied with international law. This, despite widespread public and media alarm, fueled by the very real vulnerability exposed by the exercise. Beyond the immediate geopolitical implications, the location itself offered a practical benefit to the Chinese Navy. The Tasmanian Sea, part of the notorious Roaring Forties, is known for its harsh conditions, strong winds, powerful currents, and unpredictable weather. Conducting exercises in this environment provided invaluable real-world training, preparing Chinese sailors and ships for operations in any ocean, under any conditions. Finally, the exercise broadcast Chinese power to smaller Pacific Island nations, a crucial audience as Beijing seeks to expand its influence and secure access to strategic ports, particularly outside the heavily contested first and second island chains. Nations like the Cook Islands and Kiribati, increasingly courted by China, would have taken note of this display of force and the relatively restrained response from the West. The Chinese naval exercises in the Tasmanian Sea were far more than a simple show of force. They were a calculated strategic maneuver, a multi-layered message sent not just to Australia, but to the United States and the entire Indo-Pacific region. The implications are profound and far-reaching, and they center on one critical question: how will America respond? Australia, shaken by the blatant display of Chinese power so close to its shores, will undoubtedly demand stronger security guarantees from Washington. But is the United States willing and able to provide them? With an administration potentially leaning towards a more isolationist foreign policy, and with resources already stretched thin by commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere, Washington faces a stark dilemma. If the U.S. does call China's hand, committing significant additional military resources to the southern Pacific, it risks spreading itself too thin. It could mean diverting forces from other vital regions, potentially emboldening adversaries like Russia and Iran. And, crucially, Australia, while a valuable ally, lies far from the world's major economic centers and busiest trade routes, raising the question of whether a massive commitment of resources to its defense is strategically justifiable. However, if the U.S. doesn't respond forcefully, if it fails to reassure its allies and deter further Chinese assertiveness, it risks something even more dangerous: the unraveling of its entire security architecture in the Pacific. The relatively weak response from Australia and New Zealand, coupled with the initially muted U.S. reaction, may have already emboldened Beijing. A perceived power vacuum in the southern Pacific, a breach in the third island chain, could have a cascading effect. Other nations in the Indo-Pacific, witnessing Australia's vulnerability and questioning America's commitment, might begin to reconsider their own alliances. They could be tempted to accommodate China's growing power, seeking economic benefits or security guarantees from Beijing instead of Washington. This could lead to a gradual, but potentially irreversible, shift in the regional balance of power and the collapse of the U.S.-led alliance system that has underpinned stability in the Pacific for decades. The Tasmanian Sea exercise was a turning point. It forced a fundamental question onto the table: is the United States prepared to defend its interests and its allies in the Pacific, even at the risk of confrontation with a rising China? The answer to that question will shape not only the future of the region, but the future of the global order.